All right, thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you're here for a presentation on the introduction of 2D mapping for floodplain managers, trying to help everyone get ready for the transition from one-dimensional study results to two-dimensional study results. If not, you're not in the right spot. But feel free to reach out to anyone of the NeDNR team if you have any questions or problems. So to start the presentation, we will do poll question number 1. What are some ways you promote flood awareness in your community? And this is a check all that apply. Links to DNR's web pages or interactive maps on your website. Pamphlets or flyers available in your office discussing floodplain information. High water marks or high water mark signs. And if you're interested in high water mark signs, please reach out to our office and we can coordinate with Silver Jackets for that. Social media, real estate hazard disclosure requirements, floodplain regulations and or permit applications available to the public, other or none that you are aware of. Thank you for that. If there are other ways that we can help share flood awareness messaging, please let us know. We're always happy to help. Our agenda for today, we'll go through a quick few slides on our goals, a summary of two-dimensional studies that are going on in Nebraska right now, the differences in modeling methods, just to give you an idea of why the results look a little bit different, and also kind of why we're here today. If everything looked the same, we wouldn't have to talk about why it's different regulating from two-dimensional modeling versus one-dimensional. We'll talk through some of the FEMA regulatory products that'll be available in 2D modeling, and then some additional data and uses for that data that will be available as part of these studies. So first section, goals for today. In FY24, FEMA's FY24 for our cooperating technical partners grant, our mapping grants, we switched to fully doing two-dimensional modeling. So we are trying to get ahead of the game before that information goes regulatory to prepare communities to be able to use that information once we get to the finish line. In addition, we want to introduce 2D modeling and the differences from two-dimensional to one-dimensional modeling so that floodplain administrators are equipped to do their jobs and also know that we're here to help. We want to highlight the changes to the regulatory data in 2D modeled areas. We have for a very long time promoted the use of the flood insurance study and most specifically the flood profile, and that is not a product of a 2D study. So we will talk through that. And then the additional data that is available in 2D study areas, and then we can highlight some of the uses for those products. So to start off, the two-dimensional base level engineering studies in Nebraska that are ongoing are shown on the screen. Ongoing or complete, I guess. And the two-dimensional base level engineering is the step before we get into data development, where we're really doing the engineering for a regulatory product. These are meant to help us decide where mapping needs to be updated and also to provide data for unmapped areas in the state. So you can see we have Little Nemaha salt and Keg weeping water, and those aren't moving to a regulatory product for a little while. We'll be tying that in with the City of Lincoln mapping in the salt watershed. And then in progress, we have the entire Republican Basin, Cheyenne, White, and Niobrara Phase 1. So we didn't get funding for all of the Niobrara, so we're funding 2 Huck 8s in that watershed, and then we'll continue with Phase 2 as soon as we have funding for that. And those are all just 2D BLE. We don't have plans for regulatory data in most of those areas right now, but that doesn't mean that won't change in the future. Our data development two-dimensional studies, we have Box Butte and Sheridan. Those were paper inventory reductions, so they are countywide. We have Middle North Platte Scotts Bluff, and that's going to address the Scotts Bluff paper map. And we will eventually get to Morrill County as well. We are working through Custer County, and that boundary looks really weird because we did partial 1D, partial 2D, and that's actually going to change because we're looking at that data now, and we'll probably expand the area that was done in 2D as we work through that. We also have Middle Big Blue and Turkey watersheds that are both ongoing. We just started phase 2 of Middle Big Blue, and we're nearing the end of the engineering phase for Turkey. We're getting ready to move into flood risk products here in not too long. And then we have some 2D modeling that was done between the channel of the Missouri River and the bluff, especially in areas where it didn't flood bluff to bluff. And this is just an overview of everything all together. So we're making pretty good progress on getting 2D coverage in the state, and hopefully we'll be adding to that fairly quickly here in the coming years. Next, we're going to go through the differences in modeling methods. So those of you who are familiar with FEMA mapping modeling right now, common standard practice in this industry is to use one-dimensional modeling. Typically, HECRAS is the program that we're using. It allows for one-directional flow. You're assuming that that flow is perpendicular to the cross-section. So if you can see my cursor, the green are the cross-sections, the blue is the streamline, and you can see all of those cross-sections are cut roughly perpendicular to that streamline. And then this is a representative cross-section. For hydrology, you are typically just entering a set flow value that was computed either from a gauge analysis, or it could have been from an HMS model or something similar. And you just enter that in, and it'll calculate until it gets a result that's within an allowable tolerance, and it's usually pretty tight, 0.01 or 0.001. So it doesn't have as much flexibility as we have in two-dimensional modeling for hydrology. It's typically steady state, and the flows only change when we enter a specific flow change location. So if there were a tributary coming in between two cross sections, we would enter a flow change location to account for that additional area. And then the results are only available at cross sections, and you can see that it's a steady state, so one elevation across the entire cross section, and then any results in between the two, especially when we get to that floodplain mapping stage, is interpolated between the two. So it's a pretty simplistic model and worked really well for what we were using it for at the time. This is a quick animation of what that looks like on kind of a watershed wide view, where you have your cross sections coming in, flow entering the system, but the limitation being anything in between cross sections, again, is interpolated when we get into GIS. Now, two-dimensional modeling is accounting for more than just cross-section. You actually are developing a grid, and you're using LiDAR data underneath. You're adding rainfall, and typically the cell sizes are 200 by 200 feet or smaller, especially as you get into a more urban area. You would have tighter cell spacing, so you would have a result coming, and the only interpolation is happening in between the cells. So much more refined results. So it uses the mesh grid for the computations, and then in this figure, every dot is a computation point. So at the centroid of each cell, you would have water surface elevation, essentially. So it's not drastically different than 1D in the fact that it's still computing along the edges of the cells, It's just averaging in the middle. And you can see that you can change your cell spacing sizing when you get into streams. We typically do tighter spacing when we get into communities so that we can show a more refined floodplain and make sure that we're accurately representing what's going on in town. It's not going to account for storm sewer. Nothing that we do for FEMA accounts for that. But it allows for multi-directional flow. So especially when we get into those watersheds where, like the Platte River, where we have the braided stream and flows kind of spill out and can go in multiple different paths, it's very beneficial in that and represents that fairly well. The hydrology can be defined either by a storm event, so we can enter an HMS hydrograph, or we can enter a known flow value similar to what we do in 1D, or we can enter a rainfall. And we typically use a 24-hour rainfall event. That's a FEMA standard, but you have a lot of flexibility in what you do. There are firms out there that are doing simulated storms too, so you could take a storm event that happened somewhere else and simulate that in the watershed that you're working in. So a lot of really exciting things that can be done in 2D. We haven't really delved into many of those realms yet, but hopefully will be in the future. And then again, the results are computed in each grid cell throughout the project area, so you have less interpolation, and it's not relying on a representative cross-section. It's actually capturing terrain data everywhere that there's a cell. And this is an example of what the results from a two-dimensional study would look like. If you see this pink line in the image on the left, that would be roughly what a cross-section would be if we were cutting a cross-section here, and then the cross-section is represented on the right. You can see that the water surface elevation is not one straight line, but it can vary as it's moving across that cross-section location, which for anyone that has seen a flood event in real life, you know that that's more accurate to what's happening, that we don't have just one steady elevation everywhere, but we see changing water surface elevations everywhere. We have a quick flood simulation that I can show. And this particular model was not conducted using rain on grid. It was using an HMS inflow. So the hydrograph, you can see when it peaks and then starts to come back down. But if we were to have shown a scenario where the rain on grid methodology had been used, you would also see the rainfall actually showing up on the simulation as well. So it wouldn't just show flow in the channel or tributary channels. It would also show, it actually kind of floods everywhere. You'll have shallow flooding that's kind of ponded up everywhere. Poll question 2, which of the following can be included in a two-dimensional study? A mesh with detailed terrain, rainfall for storm event, cross sections, multi-directional flow. Okay. So the next piece we're going to cover are the FEMA regulatory products and how those are going to change using two-dimensional modeling results. So anyone that is using the current flood insurance rate map is very familiar with the image that you're seeing on the screen. You have your lettered cross sections, you have your BFE lines, and you have a profile baseline showing up as your stream center line. In a two-dimensional study, it isn't drastically different. You still will have a base flood elevation, and you may have base flood elevations in the other parts of the study too. This particular study does not show other base flood elevations, just this one on the right side. You still will have your profile baseline. And in this study, there were 2 flow lines that are coming together in the study, which was why it was selected as a 2D study to begin with, because there were some split flows that were happening, and the modeling result was much easier to get to with split flow than a 1D study would have been. But the main difference being that we no longer have cross sections. We have what FEMA is calling evaluation lines, and they won't be straight. They won't be perpendicular to the floodplain, to the streamline. They will follow roughly the path of where that elevation is in the results of the 2-dimensional model. You can see, because this has split flow, that where it splits off on the other side of the highway, you have a different elevation on one side of the highway versus the other. And so you'll have evaluation lines that replace the cross sections. You may or may not have published base flood elevations on top of that, but at a minimum, your evaluation lines will show an elevation, and they're supposed to be spaced no farther apart than every inch on a firm panel, or every foot in drop in elevation along the flood profile. And then these evaluation lines are then what feed into the floodway data table. So before, we were collecting that data only at the cross sections, and it was really easy to go into a 1D study and compare the results from the 1D study to the floodway data table to make sure everything was lining up. In a 2-dimensional study, to make those comparisons, you would be using the evaluation lines. However, there are pieces of that floodway data table that are certainly going to be a little bit more subjective, like your cross-sectional area is probably going to be a little dependent on who is doing that calculation. So that piece will be quite a bit different as we move into the 2D modeling world. 2-dimensional study floodways are computed much differently than they were in 1D studies. And in fact, the floodway itself is really a product of a 1D study and creating a tool to make regulating development in a floodplain easier. It allowed for communities to not require specific modeling in the areas outside of the floodway. In 2D, that is going to be a lot more difficult to manage and maintain, because while the floodway is a tool that's used for that, and FEMA is going to allow for the use similar to before, pretty much any change that you make in a 2-dimensional model is going to cause a change somewhere. So they're no longer developed at cross sections and interpolated in between, as was done in 1D, where you set encroachment stations and just blocked off flow outside of that. 2-dimensional floodways actually make a lot of sense in the terms of how it's developed, where it's not just getting to that surcharge value. We're actually looking at the depth of flooding times the velocity of flooding to really hone in on the area that is the most dangerous part of the floodplain. There are a few ways that the calculation can be done for surcharge. There is the all cells method, where you would have to look at every single piece of information in the floodway and make sure that your surcharge is below the 1 foot threshold everywhere. We have found that to be pretty difficult to achieve, especially in bigger floodways that have a lot of bridges. So the other option is that you have to be within minus 0.5 to 1.5 everywhere, but anywhere that you have an evaluation line, the average along the evaluation line has to be at 1 foot or below. unless you're a state that has higher, or a community that has higher standards, and then it would be whatever that higher standard is. You'd have to be below that threshold. And on top of that, you have to make sure that any insurable structure has a surcharge between 0 and 1 foot. You can't have a negative or be above 1 foot if it's an insurable structure. So that is a lot different, and the no-rise procedure is certainly going to look different, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So to obtain a no-rise, you would incorporate that change into the model, and you would still be comparing pre-project condition to post-project condition, and depending on how the floodway was developed is how that comparison happens. So if the floodway was developed using the all cells method, then the comparison would also have to be done using the all cells method, meaning that the change in that cell would then have to not cause any rise in the cell of the post-project condition. I'm just going to be honest and say that I don't see very many scenarios where that would work, but maybe there's some magic that can happen that I'm unaware of. But if the floodway was developed using the average along the evaluation line, then you would follow that same methodology. So you would just do an average along the evaluation line, and it would be very similar to what we do today, where you would have to add the change, you would have to add evaluation lines to make sure that you are showing enough detail to be able to accurately represent the change. And then when you conduct the average along for pre-project and compare it to post-project, you just need to make sure that you're not increasing by more than 0.00 feet. So really easy to do. Just like now, it's really easy to do no rise now. But the comparison is basically at the centroid of each cell for the all cells method too, in case that wasn't clear. It's not at every face. Okay, for the flood insurance study, I mentioned that there are some changes to the floodway data table. There are no profiles for the flood insurance study anymore. So that's the biggest piece that is probably going to be the hardest to overcome. We will have depth grid information. We will, of course, have the floodway data table, even though it's a little bit different because it's not cross sections, it's evaluation lines. But not having the profile will certainly be probably the most significant change that we'll see as we move into 2D studies. And you'll see that in this example, the floodway data table will be noted with the fact that the floodway was computed by a 2D model, that the results were based on a 2D model, and give you some guidance on that. So the distance will stay the same. The width will be along the evaluation line, so it might be a really wide floodway compared to what we see now because of the movement of the elevations. That section area is a real pain to calculate using, I mean, we are calculating it using GIS. I suppose there are probably other ways that you could do it, but it's not the easiest thing to develop now. So I'm hoping that we will get some new products in the future that will be more geared towards two-dimensional results. So it won't be so hard. The velocity is going to be the average along the evaluation line, and then same with all of these results. Now, if you are in a portion of the state that has an existing study that was conducted using an ICE analysis, there's still a pretty big question mark on what ICE is going to look like in 2D. There is not currently methodology for that, which is why DNR has held off on initiating projects in the lower Platte area, and really is part of why we're not in the Elkhorns yet, because we wanted to make sure that we had a pretty solid path forward for those ice analyses before we got there. I'm hoping that through some conversations with the Silver Jackets team, we might be piloting a study area in the coming year to see if we can develop something that will work for the state so that we can move forward with some of those study areas. Poll question 3, what information is not available for a 2D study in regulatory products? Cross-sections, elevation lines, profiles, base flood elevations, and a profile baseline. So next we're going to move into the additional data and uses. And this is something that I think really is advantageous over one-dimensional modeling for any area that has flood risk products. For our most recent 1D studies, we'll have a lot of that information available, but even more beyond that. So we'll have the point and click depth information, and we'll publish the 1% and 0.2% on our interactive map. And it'll be the same as the flood risk products now, where you just click on a location and it'll pop up the depth of flooding. We won't have percent annual chance grids like we have now because of the way that calculation is done. We won't have that for 2D studies unless they come up with a different way for us to compute it. But we will have velocity data, which is really valuable, especially as we start talking about, encroaching on the floodplain. We know that that's going to raise not only the BFE, but also the velocity, and maybe it's going to raise it to a level that the community isn't comfortable with. And this will be additional data that you can use for decision making. It might also help with developing emergency evacuation routes, things like that. But in addition, we'll also have those flood simulations. You can turn on velocity vectors, so it'll even show you the direction of flow, which we've found to be really beneficial when we've taken our two-dimensional studies to the public. So it's no longer just a line on a map. It's actually showing, the water coming in and moving, spreading out, and then also receding, much like you would see during a flood. So we have had a lot of success with those types of products that will be available after. And we're hoping over time that we're going to be able to use the 2D models that we're creating during our engineering phase of work and modify those to be included in our Nebraska Real-Time Flood Forecasting, or NERF application, so that we can eventually get to statewide coverage for that product for inundation information, so that we will have that data for the state, and anytime we have a flood event, it'll just be there rather than having to create it on the fly, which is what we're doing now. So how will you be able to use this data? Not all of this data will be regulatory. In fact, right now, FEMA is leaning toward not making the depth grids regulatory, but we'll see. They're still making decisions on a lot of this, so it's possible that this will change over time. But right now, you can use it for permitting, for planning, especially FEMA, of course, is encouraging its use in hazard mitigation planning. For grant development, especially the mitigation grants. If you have any mitigation projects that will improve conditions for a community, this information will be really valuable for FEMA to see how much benefit there is, and not simply just in reduction of elevations, but velocities and whatnot. They can be used for land development decision making. Again, kind of going back to that velocity information where, maybe the development itself is safe, but there's no way for people to get out of the area without having to cross a road that's going to be overtopped and have those really high velocities. Maybe that's a decision that needs to be changed so that we are placing people in the safest areas, and we just will have a lot more information to be able to do that. Outreach and community awareness and education. Again, DNR will be taking this information to any of the meetings that we are conducting, but we host all of this data on our interactive map, which is also going through a refresh right now. So more to come on that. We'll be updating the interactive map so that it'll be hopefully a little bit more user-friendly and everything will be easier to find. Because right now I don't think our flood risk products are all that easy to find in our interactive map. But a community could use this at, in helping educate someone that's coming in to get a permit, or, there are a multitude of uses for that. Also for post-disaster operations, again, we are pretty regularly asked for inundation information, and we'll have the point and click depth information available through all of these studies, which we've been told is very helpful for our emergency management community and the floodplain administrators. Okay, so the last poll question, will your community use this additional data? It's yes, but would like more information first. No, we're not interested, or unsure at this time. Okay. With that was my last slide. So someone tried to come into my office when I was in the middle of the presentation, so I kind of sped through the first part of it. If anyone needs me to go back to any slides, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, we've got plenty of time for questions, so we can open it up for any discussions that anyone would like to have.